What's up, everybody? So today is January the 15th, 2025, and the Wisconsin State of Appeals has made a decision in Steven Avery's case. We're going to go over the filing that they posted earlier today, and right in the first paragraph really gives their decision, but we will go over the discussion part of the filing as well. We won't go over the background because we've gone over that time and time again, but it starts out with Steven Avery appeals a circuit court order denying his motion without a hearing on the basis that his motion was insufficiently pled. On appeal, Steven Avery argues his motion was sufficiently pled to warrant an evidentiary hearing. We disagree and affirm the circuit court's order. So right off the bat, it's denied. But let's go over the discussion part, which starts on page 8. The issue in this case is whether Steven Avery's motion was sufficient on its face to entitle him to an evidentiary hearing. As a threshold matter, we observe that on appeal, Steven Avery makes no argument regarding the sufficiency of his pleaded Brady or interest of justice claims. An issue raised in the trial court but not raised on appeal is deemed abandoned. We will therefore not consider them further. As to Avery's newly discovered evidence claims and whether his motion was sufficient to entitle him to an evidentiary hearing, sufficiency of a post-conviction motion is a question of law which we review de novo. If the motion raises sufficient facts, if true, show the defendant is entitled to relief, the circuit court must hold an evidentiary hearing. If the motion is conclusionary, or if the record conclusively demonstrates that the movant is not entitled to relief, the circuit court may deny the motion without a hearing. Steven Avery alleged he had newly discovered evidence from a new witness that provides direct connection between Bobby Dassey and the Teresa Halbach murder and planting evidence to frame Mr. Avery. When seeking a new trial based on the allegation of newly discovered evidence, a defendant must establish by clear and convincing evidence that the evidence was discovered after the conviction, which it was, the defendant was not negligent in seeking the evidence. I don't know how they could be because it came out after he had been in prison for some time. The evidence is material to an issue in the case. I would say that it definitely is. And the evidence is not merely cumulative. Once those four criteria have been established, the court looks to whether a reasonable probability exists that a different result would be reached in a new trial. The circuit court determined that the Thomas Sawinski evidence satisfied the first two prongs of the newly discovered evidence test. Evidence was discovered after Steven Avery's conviction and was not negligent in seeking the evidence. However, the circuit court stopped its newly discovered evidence analysis after it determined Avery failed to demonstrate that the evidence was material to his third-party perpetrator defense. Third-party perpetrator evidence is only material if it would be admissible under State versus Vollbrecht. On appeal, Steven Avery argues the circuit court erred by only analyzing the material of his newly discovered evidence within the confines of a third-party perpetrator defense. He argues, in determining that Mr. Avery's new evidence could only be material to the issue of potential third-party suspect, completely ignored its inherent material to other material issues in Mr. Avery's case. To the extent Steven Avery's post-conviction motion could be interpreted that the Thomas Sawinski evidence was independently material of any third-party perpetrator defense, we could conclude his motion is insufficiently pled. Avery only analyzed the Thomas Sawinski evidence within the context of a third-party perpetrator defense. As one example, the fourth prong of newly discovered evidence test requires a defendant to establish the newly discovered evidence is not cumulative. In regard to that prong, Steven Avery offered a single sentence. The Thomas Sawinski evidence provides, for the first time, the missing direct connection to Bobby Dassey as a third-party suspect for Teresa Halbach's murder, and therefore is not cumulative. Avery did not offer any that explained why his newly discovered evidence was not cumulative outside of his third-party perpetrator defense. Again, Avery did not offer any analysis that explained why his newly discovered evidence created a reasonable probability of a different outcome on retrial that was independent of his assertions that Bobby Dassey murdered Teresa Halbach and framed him for it. The circuit court properly recognized Steven Avery's newly discovered evidence was not independent from Steven Avery's attempt to meet Denny and addressed whether the evidence was material within the confines of his third-party perpetrator agreement. Steven Avery next argues the circuit court erred by denying his post-conviction motion because he asserts his newly discovered evidence satisfied Denny's legitimate tendency requirement and established Bobby Dassey murdered Teresa Halbach and framed him for it. Avery contends the circuit court imposed a substantial certainty requirement and misapplied Denny in its evaluation of whether Avery's proffered evidence satisfied the Denny elements of motive, opportunity, and direct connection. As stated previously, third-party perpetrator evidence is only material if it would be admissible under Denny. The defendant must show a legitimate tendency that the third party committed the crime, which is demonstrated by establishing the third party had motive, opportunity, and a direct connection to the crime. On these prongs is insufficient if it merely establishes a bare possibility that the third party could have been the perpetrator. We will start with motive. Motive refers to a person's reason for doing something. In evaluating the motive prong, we ask whether the alleged third-party perpetrator had a plausible reason to commit the crime. In his post-conviction motion, Avery asserted that Bobby Dassey had motive to kill Teresa Halbach because Bobby Dassey searched for violent pornography images on the family computer, which established Bobby had an obsession with violence and was more likely to commit murder. In support of his theory, Steven Avery first alleged in his motion that there were 1,625 violent pornography images recovered on the VELIE CD. He stated the recovered pornography images depicted violent images of the torture and mutilation of young females. These statements are not supported by the record's citations offered by Avery in his post-conviction motion. His computer expert's affidavit, which he cites in support of his first proposition, does not establish there were 1,625 violent pornography images on the Dassey family computer. The report simply states there were 1,625 additional images categorized as recovered pornography. Nothing in his affidavit established that each recovered pornography image was violent. As for Steven Avery's next assertion that the recovered images depicted violent images of the torture and mutilation of young females, Avery cites pages from his computer expert's affidavit in support of that proposition. However, again, the page citations offered by Steven Avery do not establish the pornographic images were violent images of torture and mutilation. At best, the citation provides that the CD contained 2,632 search results for terms. And then they list the terms: blood, body, bondage, bullet, cement, DNA, fire, gas, gun, handcuff, journal, MySpace, stab, tires, throat, RAV. If those don't... It's insane that they can say that those aren't related, if that's what they're saying. Crazy. Those search terms in no way establish that the pornography images were violent images of torture and mutilation. No, but the term, maybe not, maybe technically no, but all of those search terms are not normal search terms. Blood, body, bondage, gas, stab, tires, gun, DNA, fire. You're clearly looking this up for a very specific reason. That being said, we recognize the record does at least suggest there were some pornographic as well as gory images found on the Dassey family computer. We will therefore assume, for purposes of Avery's post-conviction motion, that there were some quantity of what could be classified as violent pornographic images found on the communal computer. However, even with that assumption, the fundamental problems with Steven Avery's motion is that he fails to tie these violent pornographic images to Bobby Dassey. In his post-conviction motion, Steven Avery attempted to tie these images to Bobby by arguing that because Bobby routinely worked night shifts and was at home during the day from 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., while other members of his family were routinely at school or work, it followed that Bobby conducted the searches for these images. This is purely speculative. I mean, it is speculative, but you got to get the A to B somehow, and it makes sense that if those things were searched during those times, and if it was indeed the only person home, everyone else was at work or school, AI wasn't a thing. The computer wasn't searching these terms on their own, so he did it, or some random person in the house did it. Like, somebody clearly searched those terms. Even if you don't believe it's Bobby Dassey, who was in the house during those times, searching, that Bobby was there by himself searching those terms? Who was there when Bobby was alone in the house doing this? So somebody else was there. Moreover, to establish Bobby's obsession with violence, Steven Avery alleged 128 searches for the most violent porn images primarily occurred on weekdays when only Bobby Dassey was in the Dassey residence. In support, it feels like I say everything and then it comes up in this thing. In support, Steven Avery cited his computer's expert's second supplemental affidavit. However, of the searches listed, only 28 of them, occurred between 7 a.m. and 3:45 p.m. on a weekday. It's still 28, it's still not good. Then, of those 28 searches, only 3 of them occurred before Teresa Halbach's murder. Maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, maybe he searched for those things. Only 3 of them occurred before the murder because he was somebody, even if it's not Bobby Dassey, somebody was searching for what to do. And if most of the searches happened after, they were trying to figure out how to clean it up. Even accepting Steven Avery's unsupported speculation that only Bobby had access to the Dassey computer, well, if no one else was home, that's not really unsupported. During that time frame and conducted the searches, and assuming that the 3 searches were in fact for violent pornography, Steven Avery failed to explain in his post-conviction motion how someone only possibly having searched for pornography 3 times, established his theory of motive, that Bobby had an obsession with violence and therefore was more likely to commit murder. His allegation is conclusionary and speculative. The circuit court found that Avery's motion was insufficiently pled because Steven Avery provided nothing that would establish Bobby was the one who conducted the searches for the pornography found on the Dassey family computer. That's true. There's no proof that he was the one that searched it, but somebody had to search it, and if it's done at a time when he's there alone, it's either him or he's not actually alone. The circuit court also observed the search terms used were generic and broad and did not closely resemble anything to the case. I don't know about that. Those search terms were pretty specific. The circuit court noted that there were only a small amount of searches that occurred before Halbach's murder. You don't really need to search for anything more than once, especially if you're looking for something specific. You can find, like, how to get rid of DNA, and there's your search. The court also observed the 2 expert opinions Steven Avery submitted were based on the unsupported assumption that Bobby conducted the searches and were produced without any forensic or psychological examination of Bobby himself. We agree with the circuit court that Steven Avery's post-conviction motion does not sufficiently allege non-conclusionary facts that Bobby had motive to kill Teresa Halbach. We could stop the analysis here. After all, by failing to sufficiently allege non-conclusionary facts demonstrating Bobby had motive to kill Teresa Halbach, Steven Avery has not established that his newly discovered Thomas Sawinski evidence is material for his third-party perpetrator defense. We next turn to the second prong of the legitimate tendency test, opportunity. Opportunity asks whether the alleged third-party perpetrator could have committed the crime in question. The defense theory of a third party's involvement will guide the relevance of opportunity evidence in a Denny case. Sometimes opportunity can be established by simply showing the third party was at the crime scene. However, when the theory of how the third party committed the crime requires that person to have carried out a series of complicated and difficult tasks, it is not enough to show the third party's mere presence at the scene and unaccounted for period of time. In his present motion, Steven Avery alleged that Bobby Dassey killed Teresa Halbach on October 31st, 2005, and then framed him for it. Therefore, to establish opportunity in the case, Steven Avery must provide some evidence that Bobby Dassey had the realistic ability to engineer such a scenario. Steven Avery contended that Thomas Sawinski's affidavit established Bobby was in possession of Teresa Halbach's vehicle and had the opportunity/access to the items that were used in the frame-up. Even if, let's just say, Bobby didn't do this, there's a witness that seen him with the car. That should still, probably be explained. Why did this person see Bobby Dassey with the RAV4? Why did this person come forward, sign an affidavit, and say that he saw this? The Thomas Sawinski affidavit, however, only stated that Thomas Sawinski saw Bobby and another individual pushing a blue-colored RAV4 on November 5th, 2005. Nothing in the Thomas Sawinski affidavit linked Bobby Dassey to Teresa Halbach's RAV4, its key, or electronics. Steven Avery failed to offer anything other than speculation that Bobby possessed Teresa Halbach's RAV4 in its key or electronics. The court just really doesn't want to believe this guy for whatever reason. They're trying to do absolutely everything they can to make this part of the evidence mean absolutely nothing, when in reality it's a pretty big piece of evidence that this guy saw someone else with the RAV4. Like, it's not speculative. They're just calling him a liar. If that's what they're saying. They're just saying they don't believe him. Additionally, but they won't even give him more than the affidavit to explain. They won't bring him in. They won't question him. They won't put him in front of a judge, jury, or anybody else to explain it more. They're just like saying this guy lied. Additionally, although Steven Avery argued Bobby had access to his blood, Avery claimed Bobby knew Steven Avery was bleeding one day and Steven Avery left blood in his trailer sink. Steven Avery only offered conclusionary statements and speculation that Bobby Dassey would be able to successfully collect and plant Steven Avery's blood in a way that went undetected by crime scene professionals. These guys were anything but professionals. Steven Avery did not explain how Bobby Dassey had access to any of the other forensic evidence in this case. In his post-conviction motion, Steven Avery omitted any allegation that Bobby had access or the ability to collect and transfer his DNA, which was found on Teresa Halbach's hood latch and her RAV4 key. Steven Avery also admitted that police found a bullet inside Steven Avery's garage that contained Halbach's DNA, and the bullet was fired from a rifle that was found in Steven Avery's trailer. The circuit court observed that, pursuant to Wilson, Steven Avery's theory of Bobby Dassey's involvement required Steven Avery to provide evidence that Bobby Dassey had the realistic ability to carry out the complicated plan that he alleged was used to frame him. See Wilson. And then it lists the statute. The court noted that Steven Avery speculates on many points as to how Bobby Dassey could have carried out the plan to frame Steven Avery, but the Wilson test requires more. But what if there actually isn't more, and this is all there is? Allegedly, it's just speaking for any other case. If that's all there is, and you're honest to God innocent in prison, you're pretty much screwed, right? The court determined Avery failed to offer any evidence that Bobby Dassey had the scientific knowledge to recognize the significance of each piece of the forensic evidence supposedly planted by him, let alone establish that he had the skill to plant the evidence in a way that would stand up to scientific scrutiny by professional crime scene analysts. The court concluded all of the allegations implicating Bobby in the murder and the framing of Steven Avery were pure speculation and not supported by any evidence submitted by Steven Avery. We agree with the circuit court. We conclude Bobby Dassey's mere presence on the Avery property and the Tomaszewski affidavit saying Bobby Dassey was pushing a RAV4 5 days later after Teresa Halbach's murder does not establish any facts showing Bobby could have actually accomplished committing Teresa Halbach's murder and planting all of the evidence in the case. But why did they have the RAV4 then? Say he didn't do any of the other stuff. Why did he have the RAV4? I need to do a video on that. Nothing in the Tomaszewski affidavit establishes Bobby was in possession of the evidence that Avery asserts was used to frame him. In short, Steven Avery's post-conviction motion fails to allege sufficient facts to support his theory that Bobby had the opportunity and could have killed Teresa Halbach and framed Steven Avery. We could again stop the analysis here. In his post-conviction motion, Steven Avery already failed to sufficiently plead 2 prongs on the Denny test. Once more, in the interest of completeness, we will continue the analysis. The third prong of the legitimacy test is a direct connection. Direct connection is addressed by considering the evidence in the conjunction with all the other evidence to determine whether, under the totality of the circumstances, the evidence suggests that a third-party perpetrator actually committed the crime and takes the defendant's theory beyond mere speculation. No bright lights can be drawn as to what constitutes a third-party direct connection to the crime, but it must be more than a connection between the third party and the crime. It requires some direct connection between the third party and the perpetration of the crime. In his post-conviction motion, Steven Avery argued the Tomaszewski evidence demonstrates that Bobby Dassey could have committed the murder because he is in possession of Teresa Halbach's vehicle. Whether the murder likely occurred as evidence by Teresa Halbach's blood in the where the murder likely occurred as to evidence by Teresa Halbach's blood in the vehicle. The vehicle is a key piece of evidence in the crime. We agree with the circuit court that what Thomas Lewinsky said, that he saw Bobby Dassey and someone else pushing the RAV4 on November 5th, 5 days after Teresa Halbach's murder, do not provide a direct link between Bobby and the perpetration of the murder. So again, why did he have the RAV4? Nor any factual link between Bobby and any of the forensic evidence other than the RAV4. Of course, that's not there. I added that part. At most, Thomas Lewinsky's affidavit established a possible connection between the third party and the crime. However, that is not enough. Steven Avery's that's not enough. That's not enough! Steven Avery's post-conviction motion does not sufficiently allege facts that demonstrate Bobby had a direct connection to murdering Teresa Halbach and framing Steven Avery for it. Because Steven Avery's post-conviction motion did not allege sufficient facts to satisfy the Denny requirements for third-party perpetrator evidence, the Thomas Lewinsky evidence is not material and therefore does not satisfy the newly discovered evidence test. We therefore do not determine whether the evidence is not merely cumulative or whether a reasonable probability exists that a different result would be reached at a new trial. Avery's motion is insufficiently pled. We pause here to discuss the affidavit from Thomas Burish. As stated previously, after briefing on Avery's post-conviction motion concluded, Avery filed an affidavit from Thomas Burish. Avery's post-conviction counsel moved to amend a single paragraph in the post-conviction motion, so the amended paragraph would read, the Thomas Lewinsky evidence provided by Mr. Lewinsky to Steven Avery's current post-conviction counsel is newly discovered evidence which provides the missing direct connection between Bobby Dassey and Teresa Halbach's murder, making him a Denny suspect. Mr. Thomas Burish corroborates the previously filed affidavit of Thomas Lewinsky and that Bobby Dassey was driving the RAV4 vehicle of Teresa Halbach on Friday night, November the 4th, or early Saturday morning after her disappearance on October the 31st, 2005. The circuit court analyzed Thomas Burish's affidavit and determined nothing in Thomas Burish's affidavit linked Bobby Dassey to Teresa Halbach's murder. Other than the fact he had her car, I guess that's no big deal. We conclude Steven Avery's motion is insufficiently pled in regard to Thomas Burish's affidavit. Avery referenced Thomas Burish one time in the entirety of his post-conviction motion. He did not offer any analysis or assertions within his motion as to how Thomas Burish's affidavit meet the 4 criteria of newly discovered evidence or established a reasonable probability that a different test would be reached at trial. Avery did not sufficiently plead the Burish affidavit as newly discovered evidence. In any event, we agree with the circuit court that Burish's affidavit does not link Bobby Dassey to Teresa Halbach's murder. Finally, Steven Avery argues the circuit court made a variety of factual errors in its written decision that are unsupported by the record. We have already addressed some of these errors. Other examples include that the court referred to Bobby as Brian at one point in its decision, stated Brendan was forensically linked to the crime. Not true. There's nothing that forensically links Brendan to anything. And Halbach's bones were found in Avery's burn barrel. Her electronics were found here. Her bones were found in multiple locations, including Avery's burn pit, and stated bone fragments from almost every bone in the human body were found in the burn pit. This statement, however, was proven at trial by the forensic anthropologist, who found at least one fragment from nearly every bone in the human body within the burn pit. We have reviewed the errors and conclude they have no bearing on the circuit court's denial of Avery's post-conviction motion. The biggest one there for me is saying that Brendan Dassey was forensically linked to the crime when he wasn't, and that shows to me that whoever was in charge of that paid absolutely no attention to anything in the case. By the court, Order affirmed. The opinion will not be published. I don't know what that means because it's published. Maybe that means there's no like trial to court or something. And that's it. 22 pages. They denied his, they denied Steven Avery once again. They denied Kathleen Zellner once again. I saw something earlier that it looks like they're going to the Supreme Court next. Don't know how long that takes. I know the Supreme Court only sees a specific number of cases each year, so it'll be interesting to see how quickly that gets done or how long they have to wait. If any more news comes out about this, I will definitely bring it to you. But once again, Steven Avery was denied a new trial and evidentiary hearing, and that was why. What do you think? Let me know. Leave some comments below. I hope you're having a good day, and I will see you again soon.